Buenos dias, bon dia, good morning. On behalf of the University Pompeu Fabra, my name is Tony Luna, and I'm the Vice-Rector for International Relations at the university. And it's a pleasure for me to open this last session on African issues, African debates, organized by our dears, appreciated alliance with the other three universities of the Alliance for Universities. This is a project that was organized by the Alliance a long time ago. It's been very difficult to organize during the pandemic period, and happily at the end we were able to finish and organize this. This is the last session of the 4. As you know, we have sessions on gender issues, another one on migration, that both of them took place in Madrid, and then one that took place last week on climate change and food production in Autonomous University of Barcelona, and this final one that will be about cultural issues here in Barcelona. I would like to thank Isabel Valverde and Carmen Ceres for organizing this. They were both the previous vice-rectors of Autonomous Madrid and Pompeu Fabra, and they were the ones who lead this project. I just got into this idea and this whole thing when it was almost finished, and it's been for me a pleasure. Unfortunately, I've been able to follow just a bit of it, but it's been the debate behind all the things we've done here. It's been intense, really fruitful, and very interesting. The other thing I should say is that for different conversations I've had in the last 2 or 3 weeks, Africa is becoming on the top of the agenda for many different institutions in Europe. So the European Union, it seems that they want to emphasize African topics, African collaboration, African research on a perspective that I think that's the base of these 4 sections. That is not a new form of post-colonial domination, that is more a collaborative type of ideas. So the idea of collaborating with research universities in Africa on one-to-one, face-to-face and equal terms, taking into account the differences in resources and differences in different issues. So I think this thing, I should thank both again, Carmela and Isabel, to being so visionary to see how important this topic is that now everyone is talking about. So this is for me. Let me pass the word to AGUS Morales. Yeah, say it right. That will be the chair of this session that we will have today, and he's going to introduce the different people who's going to participate in this session.
And thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It's an honor to be here. Thank you to the 4 universities and today also the University Pompeu Fabra, who is hosting us. And today we have a very interesting debate. I'm looking forward to it, to learn from all the speakers. We had also other 3 sessions. We are speaking about different very interesting and very specific issues, which they were about, for instance, migration, food security, etc. And today we will focus on cultural appropriation and repatriation in Africa. As you know, this is a very, I would say, even a burning issue. It goes beyond academia and media. We have here a very interesting panelist who will share their views about this issue. Okay, just for everyone who's here in the audience and also online, just for you to know how will it go. We will start with a keynote speaker. I will introduce him briefly now. We will have some questions, debate with him shortly. We will have just a 5-minute break. And then we will have the debate with all the panelists. So at any point, any moment, please share your questions via the chat or via YouTube. I'm here, I can see the questions. Also, there's some other people helping me, so I will see the questions. And I will try to convey the questions to everyone or to a specific panelist or person. So now or later, whenever you can drop the question here, we won't forget about the question. Okay, so we'll discuss today about what to do with the colonial heritage held in museums. This is a key discussion right now. And as you know, this growing controversy reveals the need for account for the polarized positions of these debates, ranging from scholars, activists, and community members championing the return of objects to correct historical wrongs, to those who contend that objects should be retained irrespective of circumstances of acquisition by museums in light of their universal cultural and scientific value. In the middle, there are advocates of more relational heritage practices, comprising dialogue and sharing in how objects are distributed. I think we will have different views today regarding this. So let me just introduce our keynote speaker. His name is Professor CIRAJ RASSOOL. He's Professor of History at the University of the Western Cape and directs its African program in Museum and Heritage Studies. He is an associated member of the Global South Studies Center at the University of Cologne and a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Luschan Collection in Berlin. He has been on the boards of the District 6 Museum, EasyCo Museums of South Africa, the South African Heritage Resources Agency, and the National Heritage Council of South Africa. He has previously chaired the Scientific Committee of the International Council of African Museums and currently serves on the High-Level Museums Advisory Committee of UNESCO. Professor RASSOOL has published widely in the fields of political biography, museum and heritage studies, memory politics, and visual history. His latest books, it's always very important to mention the books, are The Politics of Heritage in Africa, Economies, Histories, and Infrastructures, co-edited with Derek Peterson and Kojo Gavua, and Unsettled History, Making South African Public Pasts, written with Leslie Witz and Gary Mingley. So without further delay, please, Professor RASSOOL, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, colleagues. It's an enormous pleasure to address you today, and I address you ultimately from Cape Town, where I returned to very late last night after having spent a few days in Amsterdam, where we had a large conference on the new project there called Pressing Matter, which is exactly about these issues, about the future of the ethnographic museum and about restitution. I was meant to travel to Germany with 12 of my students to go and do some work in the collections of 4 museums. But as you will know by now, the world has changed in the last few days, and I returned home. And this is a fast-moving field. As you know, there are changes every day, and there is growing excitement in these debates. And over the past 5 years or so, a new willingness has emerged in European countries to inquire into the ethics of their museum collections acquired under colonial conditions, to face up to a new era of restitution of human remains, and the possibility also of the restitution of colonial artifacts, artworks, and documentation, photographs, film, sound recordings, especially those assembled within a context of injustice. At present, these advances have been contained in separate inquiries within disciplines and disciplinary museums. Yet deliberations have not paid sufficient attention to how these collections were often acquired together during the same expeditions and often by the same collectors, nor to how these were distributed thereafter between collecting institutions and disciplines, and how these disciplines were later reorganized. while it might now seem more reasonable to consider colonial collections of skulls and skeletons as being marked by violence, the time has arrived to reconsider the frameworks of preservation and stewardship that have attached themselves to all aspects of the ethnographic. Colonialism's violence took the form of plunder, rapaciousness, and defilement of the human body through physical anthropology, but it was also an unacknowledged and repressed characteristic of the supposedly more humane ethnological. As we consider the contested nature of ethnographic objects and other forms of documentation in Austrian, German, and other European museums, we also need to consider how much the world has changed since the modern museum and its fundamental features first emerged. The creation of a world after colonialism might have occurred for the most part in political terms. However, we are still deeply immersed in the epistemic struggle to change the colonial frames through which we understand societies and people. The same goes for institutions such as museums, through which the societies and people of the world have been collected, classified, and made knowable. And we all live with the legacies of colonial violence that led to the appropriation of African bodies, artworks, and artifacts, and that accompanied the birth of the ethnographic museum. Far from being the institution of care, as proclaimed by museum discourses, we are learning just how much museums were part of the weaponry of death. I want to suggest that the frames of the stewardship of collections for future generations are insufficient to maintain and defend the old museum. New powerful approaches argue in favor of restitution and for the museum to be understood as a process and as an interrogative project, a project of interrogation and questioning. These approaches need to accompany urgent programs of restitution through which African artifacts and artworks are to be returned. But restitution is not just the geographic reorganization of collections. It represents new possibilities for rethinking what we mean by museum. And it is in these restitution claims, of the claims-making processes, in the consultations and negotiations, that the new concept of museum as process will be found, as a way of settling the dilemmas of the unsettled and unsettling objects in the modern museum of coloniality. As I have argued before, the museum is not only an institution of modernity and ordered citizenship, but it is the primary institutional form of empire and coloniality. It was made and is being remade and adapted through both sides of colonialism's history by a rapacious and violent empire of plunder and pacification, as well as by empire as benevolent colonization, humanitarianism, and trusteeship over people and things. This was a simultaneous expression of collecting, documenting, and governing in the name of safeguarding and preserving. Collecting, documenting, and governing things and people through appropriation and stewardship. While it has become more widely accepted that human remains collecting and physical anthropology research were part of the violence of colonialism and racism, it is important also to re-examine the humanist and caring associations of collecting and preserving material culture. The ethnographic has come to mean many things at the beginning of the 20th century. As discipline of the other, named as anthropology, volkenkunde, volkerkunde, ethnologie, and ethnologia, with different colonial and post-colonial histories. But it is also a research method based upon close-up, detailed, and long-term field-based research. And while different anthropologies have undergone significant self-scrutiny and reassessment since at least the 1970s, this self-analysis has been uneven between different colonial histories and between the academy and the museum. In the German-speaking world, where I've been doing a lot of my research in recent years, collections were separated and spread across different museums in spite of their connected collecting histories through the simultaneous collection of skeletons, material culture, and other forms of cultural documentation. In the German-speaking world, anthropology was separated into ethnologie on the one hand and anthropologie on the other hand, with the former standing for social and cultural anthropology and the latter for physical anthropology. As a consequence, colonial era human remains and material culture have artificially occupied separate spheres of debate and policy formation in Germany. In Germany and Switzerland, ethnographic museums have begun to rebrand themselves, in Austria as well, as museums of world cultures, while remaining museums of the arts and material cultures of societies of the former colonial empire. Others, such as the Tropenmuseum in the Netherlands, which was also incorporated in 2014 into a bigger structure of a National Museum of World Cultures. This Tropenmuseum had chosen many years ago to turn its museum methods on itself, with its own histories of collecting, the focus of its museum renovation project, which it did in the late 2000s. In France, as you will all know, the shift at the Musée du Quai Branly, founded in 2006, was to elevate the position of so-called non-Western artworks from primitive art and art premiere into masterpieces, aestheticized with dramatic spotlights on individual objects in a generally dark environment, as a homage to people who had suffered conquest, violence, and humiliation, with the political object of proclaiming France's openness to the world. This museum's fine art displays of remarkable examples of masks and statues from Africa and Oceania, amongst others, also sought to confirm, we learned, the equal dignity of the cultures of the world. At Weltkulturenmuseum in Frankfurt, that museum sought a method of working with its collection through the presence of artists living and working in the museum, engaging with artworks and artifacts from the collection, interpreting them and intervening in their biographies in the museum through creative work. I apologize for my dogs wanting to join me in the presentation. As part of the process of exhibition making, museum spaces were turned into laboratories of engagement and debate, with artists, curators, scholars, and lawyers engaging in processes of interrogation, interpretation, and exchange. These proceedings of a museum of process were a means of adding to the shaping of museum meanings, in refusing to abide by the logic of the ethnographic Weltkulturen Museum during those times began to reposition itself as a post-ethnographic museum. And that post-ethnographic, by the way, is post with a hyphen. There are all of these different meanings that are generated depending on whether one abandons the hyphen or retains the hyphen. So this was wanting to be a museum after the ethnographic, one that inquires into what the appropriate museologies would look like after colonialism. Now, these ethnographic meanings have traveled and continue to travel together between the academy and the museum, between researching and collecting, publication and exhibition. Between the 1960s and the 1980s, major reassessments took place in scholarship on African and other societies, of the work of disciplines of anthropology and history, of producing knowledge about African societies, as well as of the disciplinary division between them. While the rise of African nationalism and independence movements on the African continent were important impulses in the rise of African history, anthropology underwent a period of self-assessment in an attempt to turn its back on colonial legacies. These disciplinary reassessments were uneven between different societies and colonial histories. Between those former colonizing societies which were confronted by African national liberation struggles, by African freedom struggles, and those that did not. Between the academy and the museum, and between different parts of the former colonized world. So we need to understand colonialism historically and the configuration of disciplines in these different colonial histories as we analyze the conditions of restitution and what is possible, what is enabled in relation to these disciplinary histories. The major challenge is to shift from an understanding of colonialism as time and place and as a formal system of rule to an appreciation of coloniality as an epistemology, as a politics of knowledge. This would enable a much wider understanding of coloniality as embedded in deep structures of knowledge, in the character and shape of disciplines, in the museum and the university. Colonialism would then be appreciated as more than merely a specific period or even a topic of history, as was the approach in the exhibition on German colonialism held in 2016 at the German Historical Museum in Berlin. Notwithstanding how powerful this exhibition was, and it's so interesting to learn, more and more time I spend in Germany, how German museums and universities have continued to be marked by coloniality in peculiar ways through the persistence of 19th century disciplinary systems and classificatory divisions. And as I have argued to my colleagues there, their debate, their discussions about decolonization take on a very specific character, when in the German universities, they do not have African history. The colleagues there who study African societies and aspects of their history are usually employed in special departments of what they call Afrikanistik, where regions of the world are named into disciplines, and where the sub-disciplines of Afrikanistik tend to be ethnology and language studies. And sometimes you have this emphasis, some kind of historical emphasis, but without African history having developed as a disciplinary space in departments of history. as they have elsewhere. Now, some ethnographic museums have laid emphasis on provenance research on their artifacts and artworks from colonial contexts. And that is a peculiar German emphasis that has developed out of and in relation to a prior difficult history about the Holocaust and about understanding provenance, the provenance of violence that might be connected with acquisition of artifacts, and whether artifacts and artworks were acquired under conditions of injustice and through violence. So there's a sensitivity to the possibility of violence. So there's been this emphasis on provenance research from colonial, on artifacts and artworks from colonial contexts. And there's also been an emphasis on partnerships with and loans to museums in source societies. This was an emphasis that began to develop about 5 years ago, just before the debate on restitution itself got opened up much more widely. These approaches on partnerships have tended to emphasize the entangled histories between former colonized societies and their former colonizers, as well as methods of co-curatorship and object sharing. Now, I've also come to understand that the scholarship that emphasizes this entanglement and of co-curatorship and object sharing, as exemplified in the project that got published 2 or 3 years ago, co-edited by Philip Schorch and Connell McCarthy, who also worked with Nick Thomas, a project called Curatopia. In some ways, those kinds of approaches and methodologies emerged from the peculiar forms of colonialism in the Pacific. But this approach, I would argue, constituted a neo-colonial embellishment upon the assertion that European museums had made in the early 2000s, that indeed they were universal museums that had preserved collections on behalf of humanity. And we went through a very interesting engagement with those claims to universality and what the narratives of that universality were. Such emphasis on entanglement might as well represent the perpetuation of neo-colonialism. In reaction, following the report by Felwine Sarr and Benedict Savoy to Emmanuel Macron in 2018, we are witnessing a growing commitment to the restitution of African artworks and artifacts. With the recent return of 26 artworks by France to the Republic of Benin just a few weeks ago, and returns and a commitment to returning some of the looted Edo Kingdom artworks now distributed across Europe, the United States, and elsewhere. Some curators in German ethnographic museums, for instance, have expressed support for restitution, while curators in small ethnographic museums in Britain, Horniman, Pitt Rivers, have stressed the necessity for restitution. Small regional museums, like in Scotland, university museums have come round and have announced that they would undertake restitution. And this is especially important in light of how central museum collecting was to the project of colonial pacification in the 19th century. We know, for example, that museums were not merely beneficiaries of expeditions of conquest. Museums were embedded in those very expeditions of conquest. Perhaps Berlin has been the setting for some of the most significant contests over colonial human remains collections, over the ethics of colonial collections, and of the persistence of colonial urban traces, partly because of political pressure from German and African activists. Museums in Berlin and elsewhere in Germany have already embarked upon projects to return African human remains, sometimes of victims of colonial violence, or from corpses or skeletons illegally removed from their graves. My own research on this has been on a collecting history in Southern Africa from Austria by the first professor of anthropology in Austria, Rudolf Perch. This commitment started in Germany with returns to Namibia and is set to continue with returns to Rwanda, as well as other African societies that had been colonized by Germany, such as Tanzania, Togo. And yet German museums still need to face the implications of the fact that in many cases the scientists who had collected these remains and at the same time assembled material culture, documentation, film, images, sound recordings as part of multidisciplinary expeditions. And as I've argued to you, these collections had become separated from each other into separate disciplines and museums, and possibly also into contexts of injustice and liberal humanism. The time has indeed come for these to be considered together, with human remains, those of missing persons, and with artifacts also being in some ways missing ancestors. The time has come to depart from the paradigm of liberal humanism. We acknowledge important shifts in German state policy, with returns of Benin bronzes high on the agenda, and with this tied to increased attention to partnerships with African museums over capacity building. There's the new Museums Lab program, for example, that has met online, that we had a session, an in-person gathering in Germany recently, and is set to come during 2022 to my university in Cape Town. Notwithstanding the shifting climate of museum debates in Europe, with increased acknowledgement of violence and growing willingness to conduct restitution work, the cultural authorities in Berlin have pressed ahead with the formation of the Humboldt Forum. The latter brings together collections of the Dahlem Ethnological Museum with those of Asian art. However, in drawing upon a seemingly unproblematic 19th century intellectual history, the Humboldt Forum is set to perpetuate the colonial idea of grouping together the material culture and art of those described in the negative as non-European. In fact, even retaining the categories of ethnological and Asian art. The Humboldt Forum is thus a project of belatedness, of being part of reimagining Berlin as a major European city, and of asserting Germany's position as Western, because that position is not certain, because Germany was also previously partly communist. So that Westernness is part of the anxieties of the making of the Humboldt Forum. Now, with important steps being taken on restitution and key forums being convened almost every week, it is time to take stock of some of the important challenges. I myself used to use the term repatriation. The concept of repatriation, the concepts of repatriation and restitution seem to be like synonyms of each other. We move between one concept and the other. repatriation I think, is a term that is used mainly in the Americas, in North America, where they have interesting settler colonialisms and internal colonialisms, often with Native American indigenous groups living on reservations as a result of 19th century conquest, and where those so-called reservations have a measure of sovereignty. And so the concept of repatriation implies a certain kind of sovereignty, and but as a term, it always involves a government-to-government process, and it signifies for me also a kind of masculinist process of the concept of the nation, of a return to a patria, of a fatherland. And we have begun to talk more often of restitution not being an event, of restitution thought of as a process, of restitution being something that will not happen on one day and be finished on an arrival date. In fact, when African artworks or human remains arrive back on the African continent, that is when the work begins. Restitution is also important because it signals a process of claims making having taken place, that it sets up a claims making process. In South Africa right now, for example, we have just recently had our national policy on restitution and repatriation approved at Parliament, and our National Advisory Committee on Restitution and Repatriation will have its first meeting on the morning of the 3rd of December. All the restitutions that have happened thus far have been ad hoc. Now they will be costed. Now they will happen as part of a much more deliberate process. And this is happening in many different African countries. A few weeks ago, we also had the rebirth of the International Council of African Museums, formerly known as AFRICOM, now renamed AFRIMUHERE, African Museums, Restitution and Heritage. So it is very important that restitution be reconfigured into an African-led program of building and making claims, because otherwise restitution will be a process of European gift-making. And as a process of European gift-making, it will fail. This is not just a matter, a state-to-state matter. As important as diplomatic and legal procedures and negotiations are, this needs to be a community-based program. This needs to be a claims-based program. So we need to also admit that this is about enhancing agency, about recognizing and enhancing activism. And we are really at an important juncture here, where I think it is possible for us, as we proceed through these discussions, to rethink what we mean by museum. That restitution is not going to be an overnight event. It's going to be a project that is going to remain with us for some time. And that restitution could indeed form the basis of a new museology. Yes, we have to understand that in many ways, restitution is a program of law, of policy, of politics. Restitution is going to be one of the main platforms of the work to be done by the African Union. It is on the agenda of the upcoming meeting between the African Union and the European Union. There would be pressures, I would imagine, in every European society at a state level right now, just as the pressures are increasing in African societies. But restitution is also about the restoration of the dignity of the people. In the words of Felwine Sarr and Benedict Savoy, about a new ethics of humanity. We need to acknowledge the important work, the pressure of the activists, the pressure that has been mounted by African diaspora activists in Europe that have been without which we would not be at this point. And yeah, I want to make two more points before I come to discussing the post-ethnographic museum. That as much as we should not think about restitution as an event, we must also think about restitution alongside reparations. Yeah, there is an important discussion to be had about financial reparations. We have learned so much in recent years about the compensation payouts that were paid to the former owners of enslaved people and the institutions involved in enslavement. This led to a reparations payout by Glasgow University to the University of the West Indies. But reparations is also more than financial payouts. We need to think of reparations as reparatory work that needs to happen, in the same way as restitution should be a program of work that lays out an agenda. And we also need to say that mere restitution is not decolonization. Decolonization includes restitution, but decolonization also requires epistemic work. There would be no proper restitution if you're talking about the return of ethnographic artifacts from a museum in Europe to an ethnographic museum on the African continent, because that does not understand how the ethnographic was made as part of the government of colonized people, that the ethnographic is a location of the government of people and objects. And I have written extensively about the failure of the ethnographic museum on the African continent and what the roots are to undoing that legacy. So the transformation of museums may involve research into the ethics of acquisition through provenance research, as well as an inquiry into the relationship between collections and living historical cultures, including one's own. It also involves a deep critical historical investigation into the knowledge systems surrounding objects and collections in an approach that questions colonial categories. Some of the work of my colleagues here in Cape Town at the University of Cape Town has shown how important this is for what they call untribing the archive in the case of South African collections and documentalities. We're also learning about the extent to which museum labels and documentation have concealed the violence of the acquisition of many artifacts and artworks. The post-ethnographic museum, and this is a post-ethnographic without a hyphen. Just like we get a post-colonial and a post-apartheid without a hyphen. This post-ethnographic museum points to the possibility that the modern museum of the world as we know it, which emerged as part of the making of the modern person, and that coincided with the colonization of the world, has outlived its value. This post-ethnographic museum can only be the outcome of a sustained engagement with the basic museum work of collecting, conservation, exhibition, and education in ways that enter into battle with the colonial concepts of race and ethnic group that seem naturalized and frozen In general, it is critical to think about the connections between the administration of people and the administration of artifacts in the museum, and to simultaneously rethink society and the museum. In considering how the museum is changing, we need to understand how old collecting museums have been challenging themselves and how new interrogative museums, understood as process, have begun to expand museum horizons to embrace the downtrodden, the oppressed and exploited of the world, whose experiences might previously have been confined and contained through colonial ethnography and even a denial of coevalness. This focus on local and deep histories of oppression, displacement and survival, while guarding against the triumphalism of nationalism, needs to consider the ways it offers new understandings of what museums are, as well as the possibilities for new museologies of the 20th century. Posing questions about the museum should not merely be about expunging its rapacious histories, of shoring up the vestiges of a remaining benevolence, framed as preservation and stewardship. The most progressive edge of such reformed benevolent museum is what Clifford called the contact zone, based on the work of Pratt, as produced through the co-curatorship of science and indigeneity working together. This model of a reformed museum retained the classificatory order and hierarchy of empire, but relied upon greater participation by source communities, with the museum placed on a more ethical footing. Rather, it requires that questions be posed about the syndrome of preservation itself. This age of an ethical engagement with human subjects and of a new ethics of collecting has seen the emergence of new programs to prevent museums from benefiting from the illicit traffic in artifacts, and in a significant move by many museums of culture and nature to cleanse themselves of their human remains and of other sensitive collections deemed to have been collected unethically or acquired in a context of injustice. Sometimes these changes have taken the form of a partial cleansing through merely removing the store of human remains or sensitive collections and creating cultural centers jointly managed by science and the indigenous. Such processes of reform might have created more socially responsive and ethically grounded museums, but they have left the empire of the museum intact. Transforming the museum requires embarking upon projects of restitution, not just as return, but also as a methodology of rethinking what we mean by museum. It also requires understanding the history of the museum as the locus of empire and coloniality in all of its forms, and to embark on the difficult work of interrogating its collecting histories and epistemologies. The museum needs to be reconceptualized outside evolutionary frames and the impulses of preservation and atonement. The post-colonial museum may indeed require the inauguration of the post-museum itself. Thank you very much.
Professor RASSOOL, thank you very much. I don't know if you heard the people clapping in the audience. Very good. Okay, I think we can use 5 minutes for questions for Professor RASSOOL. I don't know if anyone in the audience here wants to make a question to Professor RASSOOL. Anyone online also? I think it was very interesting speech. He was speaking about the post-ethnographic museum, about the difference between repatriation and restitution, some forms of perpetuation of colonialism. I mean, it was so much to speak about that maybe we can pick up later also in the debate. Even at the end, he left us with the idea of the post-museum era. No, I don't know. Just making time to see if you have any question here in the audience. No questions? No, there's no questions. Okay, I think everyone is astonished, Professor RASSOOL, so they don't have questions. But if you don't mind, I mean, because we need to go soon, fast to the round table. But since you finished with this idea, which is very interesting about this post-museum, I don't know if to call it era or like this concept, where does it drive us? What's your idea of this post-museum moment?
You know, if you think philosophically and epistemologically about the contexts that we are currently immersed in, about restitution, about human remains, when you actually do restitution work, you are not merely cleaning up the museum. You unsettle the very institutional fabric of the museum that is founded on a preservationist impulse, which I think is a 19th century phenomenon. And it's especially a kind of a post-abolitionist. It comes in the wake of abolitionism, and when you think about the amazing projects that have emerged, some in South Africa, some in Kenya, in other African countries, but most importantly, I think in Latin America, in Brazil, in Colombia, in other parts of Latin America, where we've also had the growth of what Spanish and Portuguese speakers call social museology, and which has hardly been translated into the English-speaking world, and where I think most of the important debates have actually happened in Portuguese and Spanish, where you've had these new museum forms such as Museu da Maré in Rio de Janeiro, and where the Brazilian Museums Association has had a social museology project, and where you have these new museum projects that have emerged that are museums without collections. They are museums that are projects of mobilization. They're projects of bringing dignity. They are projects in which people enter to announce themselves and where people speak to each other and where they perform. It's a very different concept of museum that is deployed. That the best example we have in South Africa is probably the District 6 Museum, which became a museum without a collection, which was a museum project that dedicated itself to defending the land. I mean, it's been through a thorough process of museumization and professionalization and formalization, but that activist nature of the museum, I think, is still fundamental to what it is. And I think if we import and transport these concepts of the museum, this post-collections, post-preservationism, into all of the ways that we are reimagining the ethnological, the ethnographic, and the classificatory systems, I think that there is tremendous fruit that can come from that, so that we are not just immersed in some extended collections management process of transferring the location of the object, but where restitution does something else. It intervenes in society as a whole. And because we are still in the early days of the beginnings of this process, there are large elements of these possibilities that we still don't know. We're at the beginning stages of this theorizing, and we need to open up the spaces. But it's very important that this is the deployment of the prefix of the post without the hyphen. Our colleagues at the Weltkulturen Museum in Frankfurt may be thinking in German, used it with the hyphen. And when there is a very big difference when you do post-colonial work with a hyphen and post-colonial work without a hyphen. The post-ethnographic without a hyphen is an engagement with the ethnographic, that when you critique the ethnographic, when you decommission the ethnographic, it doesn't mean that it ceases to exist. What we are inaugurating is the post-museum as a new politics of society, a politics of mobilizing people. And it is a new form of cultural politics. And I think we have a lot, especially the generations to come, I think, have an exciting era ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor RASSOOL. It's very interesting. I think we have all the items to go forward to the debate. So as I told you before, we have now just a 5-minute break, so only 5 minutes, and then we'll start with the debate. Unless I don't know. Okay.
Yes, I can make a question. I have a question for Professor CIRAJ RASSOOL. First of all, thank you so much for your awesome intervention. I think it was the best introduction to our debate. I would like to continue and delve into your suggestion of what is needed beyond restitution is a deeper epistemic change in order to subvert the ethnographic museum paradigm. And we also know that there are institutions that are currently, as we speak, being built in West Africa to actually host a part of this contended treasure. I don't know if you had the chance to engage with these two examples, but the Museum of Black Civilization in Dakar and the Edo Museum of West African Art in Benin City are, I think, the best example of this. Maybe can you address this topic in relation to these two institutions being built? And do you think those are a great example of post-ethnographic museums? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariela. You know, I've also learned a lot from you. So, yes, I mean, we follow these debates very closely. Sometimes the different scholars and figures in these debates are able to get together. We were meant to get together in 2 days' time in Cologne at the Resist exhibition at the Rautenstrauch Just Museum that was curated by our colleague there, Nanette Snoep. Unfortunately, that live get-together is not going to happen, but we'll get together online. And, you know, there are all kinds of differences and challenges that we need to think about, and there's no single model. You know that in the Savoir report on artworks tends to highlight the masterpiece and the artwork. And its reach has mostly been to former French African colonies and mainly West African French colonies. And the returns that have happened have been with artworks conceptualized out of the work of that report. And as part of that debate over many years, you know that one of the arguments wielded by European curators was that Africans are not able to care for these objects. They do not have the ability. And so the response to that racism has been, in some places, has been monumental. So you have a gathering of the monumental and of monumentalism. You have that in Edo Kingdom, and you have that in Dakar. You have another variant of this emerging in North Africa as a new African Union, Le Grand Musée Afrique, that is being conceptualized. But the monumental is only one kind of response. It is one kind of museum. It's very interesting that what you have there the monumental museum is also a history museum. So what you have is a very interesting shift to the historical. I mean, I heard a colleague in Amsterdam. No, it wasn't in Amsterdam. It was in a Zoom conference recently talk about an early restitution that took place to Cameroon. And when he went to see the object in the museum, no, it wasn't Cameroon, it was Burkina Faso. There was a restitution that had taken place, and he went into the museum and he was very disappointed that the exhibition showed the restitution process and didn't focus on the meaning of the object, because what he went there to see was an ethnographic display. So you have a shift in the discipline. You have a move to the history museum, because the restitution is part of claims on sovereignty, on incomplete sovereignty, and the disciplines of making yourself sovereign is the discipline of history. And so these are monumental museums, but that's not the only model. I think there are other models of restitution that might even mean that restitution is not to a museum, that restitution is to a community. Of course, there are it becomes very interesting when you take into account the disruptions that have occurred, and where you have a new community in that place that establishes and makes a claim to their belonging to the object, even though their ancestors did not live in that region. So those are all the configurations that we should allow for, and all the possibilities, because we are not reinforcing ethnicity here. This is a reconnection between artworks and material culture and community in ways, I think, that should open new possibilities. And this is exactly where a new museology can come into existence, where we have the ecomusée, we have cultural landscapes as museums, and we have all kinds of possibilities, I think, for rethinking what we have. I mean, in some ways, the monumental kind of falls into I think, a European trap of capacity building and of monumentality, of a certain kind of institution that creates a certain and that perpetuates a certain kind of citizenship. Because the question should rather be, what is the citizenship of this new museology, if it is not the regulated citizenship of the 19th century museum, where everyone was meant to know their place? A problem with that 19th century museum is that on the African continent, we have rejected the place that it gave to us.
Thank you, Professor RASSOOL, and thank you, Dr. Franzoni. Also, I will introduce Dr. Franzoni later because she's one of our panelists. So as I told you before, then we'll have now just a 5-minute break, and then we'll start with the debate. It's good because we already started, so it will be easy to go on. So thank you everyone, and see you in 5 minutes. Well, welcome back everyone. We're going now for the round table. As I explained before, what we're going to do is I will introduce all the panelists separately. I will address one question to each of the panelists, and then we'll have an open discussion. So I encourage the panelists to jump into each other, to ask them questions when we finish this first round. And of course, I encourage the audience here and online to send the questions. You can do it now, you can do it while the panelists are speaking, and we can address the question to a specific panelist or to everyone, you know, to have a open debate. I don't know if Mariela, you want to say something or?
No.
Oh, okay, sorry. So, okay, we will start with Dr. Stefano Biagietti from the Department of Humanities of this university, University Pompeu Fabra. He is a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer in African Cultural Studies, Global Studies. Dr. Biagietti is an Africanist anthropological archaeologist at UPF Pompeu Fabra Department of Humanities, and an honorary fellow at the School of Geography, Archaeology and Environmental Studies at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. His research focuses on the study of the deep history of human societies in Africa, especially in dry land environments, and in the study and preservation of the cultural heritage of pastoral societies. He teaches African Cultural Studies and Archaeology at the BA course of Global Studies in Pompeu Fabra, and he's a member of the editorial board of the journal Ethnoarchaeology. He has widely published in most prominent academic journals of African archaeology, heritage and science, and he has participated as invited or keynote speaker in several international conferences and workshops on African past. So, Dr. Biagietti, I think you are around here. The permanence of items of African origin, as we discussed in Western museums, is raising serious issues about repatriation and ownership. But how does this prompt us to reflect about the position of Africa and its past in a global historical perspective?
Okay, good morning to everyone. Yes, actually, as an archaeologist, I would like to speak about, to answer to your question, and just maybe reflecting on the fact that the issues that the topic that we are addressing today has to be somehow connected to the fact that to the idea, to the conception that we as Westerners have about Africa and its past. Actually, most of Africa's past is excluded from grand historical narratives. Africa is generally depicted as a sort of passive recipient of external inputs. Africa's past is generally sidelined in encyclopedias, in handbooks. I would like to say, I think that we can say that there is a sort of very negative and widespread attitude towards Africa's past that generally has produced a sort of neglection of Africa's past. And as Professor CIRAJ was speaking about Germans, I remember the words, the statement by Hegel, by the famous philosopher Hegel, one of the one's most prominent philosopher of our era, who say that Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. And this is something that he said, he wrote in 1830, followed one centuries later in the 60s by Hugh Credwell Roper, who was a famous British academic in both Cambridge and Oxford, who say that perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at present there is none or very little. There is only the history of Europe in Africa. The rest is largely darkness, and darkness is not a subject for history. So generally speaking, when we think about Africa's past, we think that basically African society were not able to reach any achievement, to develop basically anything. And it has to do, this misperception has to do also with the fact that history, which is a discipline born in the West, is generally identified, the beginning of history is generally identified with the invention of writing. So no writing, no history. And Africa is a place where oral history, oral tradition have been prominent. So rather than being a land of no history, we need to improve, we need to shift our disciplinary boundaries, or rather to refound the epistemology of history in order to better comprehend Africa's past. So I really agree with Professor CIRAJ's idea of revising our epistemological tools in order to address the issue that we are debating. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Biagietti. Thank you very much. We'll go on with the roundtable with the questions for all the panelists, and at the end we can wrap up some of the issues also you discussed about history in your little speech. We go now with Dr. Mariela Franzoni, also from this university, Pompeu Fabra University. She has analyzed the relationship between curating and the contemporary art market, inscribing the inquiry in the realm of curatorial theory, contributing to epistemological discussions on the notion of the curatorial. Mariela's study frames itself as an economy of the curatorial, an expression with which we define the sphere of economic relations of production and mediation engendered by curatorial practice and discourse in the contemporary art field. So Dr. Franzoni, you met her already because she had the question before to Professor RASSOOL. I would like to ask you, I don't know if you think that restitution, actually Professor RASSOOL, he was discussing this. I think we can start the debate from here also later on, no? But do you think restitution alone is sufficient to produce the shift away from the supremacy of Western ethnographic and museum narratives? And if not, what other changes or perspectives do we need to have? Please go ahead.
Thank you, AGUS. Yes, I can't but extend and delve into what Professor RASSOOL has already mentioned. The restitution process is, to me at least, necessary and irrevocable, but is also a very slow-paced process. It will take time to be made effective because the bureaucracies are different in each countries and institutions. And also because we're still facing some resistance from several of European institution leaders. And in any case, no, restitution alone is not enough. As RASSOOL mentioned, we need a deeper epistemological change to dismantle the ethnographic museum paradigm. And of course, this epistemic change is in process, has been in process since a few years now, since museums have developed strategies to understand the ethical implication of taking care of ethnographic collection. And to me, what is fundamental and need to be continued during this process is the reshaping, since I personally investigate and analyze curatorial practices in contemporary art and in general, what is fundamental is that we still keep working on this, on the reshaping of curatorial procedures within the museums, especially in order to produce new narratives that take into account the different regimes of value of these ethnographic objects, and as well to acknowledge the violence embedded into these collections. Absolutely, it's not desirable to have to replicate European model of exhibition making and research and curatorial procedure on the African continent. And for this to happen, I think we need to rethink of the scholarship that deal with these collections. And somehow this, of course, needs to be done, need to be put in the hands of the African scholarships. And absolutely, we don't need only expert, a specialized expert in each discipline, but we need to rethink the overall approach in an interdisciplinary way, an approach that is culturally heterodox and inclusive, of different hybrid disciplines, and take into account, for instance, post-colonial studies, critical studies, curatorial studies, and for what concern my field of interest, also involving practices that are more related to contemporary art. We actually have a great example since the beginning of the 90s of artistic intervention or curatorial artistic intervention into ethnographic collections. So I believe we can draw inspiration and from this past experience to shape the new scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Franzoni. Also, we can pick up some of the ideas that you mentioned in your speech later. And of course, very, very interesting. We'll go on now with Dr. Malego Bonvimi. She's a researcher and lecturer in the School of Geography, Archaeology and Environmental Studies at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. She is a multifaceted archaeologist who specializes in archaeobotany. In 2019, she graduated with a PhD cum laude from the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle de Paris, France. Her research interests include cultural heritage, plant use by past and present societies, ethnography, spatial analysis and environmental evolution in South Africa from the later Stone Age to the more recent farming communities period, and she's currently doing her research in Botswana and Namibia. Apart from research, she has a guest lecture for the University of Botswana, where she is an affiliated researcher at the and also at the University of Barcelona. Dr. Mvimi is an active archaeological consultant who is accredited with the National Museum of Botswana, and she currently sits as the Botswana Association of Archaeological Professionals Vice Secretary. Dr. Mvimi, welcome. And okay, after all this discussion, taking all that we discussed into account, what should be the role of African museums and institutions?
Thank you for having me. I must say that I am going to be very short. So if we look at the museum as it can be used like a book where you go and read. But for the African context, I think that, for example, there is a lot of dissociation between the places where the museums are placed and the communities that live around it. So let's take the local communities, for example, that have a history that the museum was established in with the colonial ideologies, where sometimes the artifacts that are found in the museum were taken from them when they were still in use. So they always look at museums as an alien space that they cannot associate with. So two, then they do not have the knowledge that they can use to read and interpret the artifacts that are in the museum. That one belong to them, but at the same time, they are expected to go and look at, and sometimes they don't understand for what purposes. So in that case, what can be done in order to have inclusivity, to have the local communities be interested in the museums? That the museums in Africa don't be used as places where people go to hang out, to cool down and have a nice time, as opposed to the European contexts where the museums are really organized and they serve a purpose of, they serve an educational purpose. But also at the same time, it looks like the African Museum is folding its hand or lagging behind. But it might be because they lack the financial capacities to put into place the relevant spaces for the African museums that can be used by Africans. So since the funders are usually the Western world, this kind of puts them in a trap where there is a notion of political powers playing, that the display, the interpretation, and the artifacts that are found in the museum can only be a certain way. That kind of still brings us back to the colonial or pre-colonial presentation of the museum and their artifacts. So also the African Museum should look now into working with scholars that are working on African heritage and they're interested in that, in order to reform the African Museum, and also to have the local governments have interest and have an investment in the development of their own heritage. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mvimi. We'll continue the discussion later. Also, just a reminder for the people following us online, you can we'll start a debate later with all the panelists, but you can already drop your questions here in the chat of the Zoom. And we are going to speak with Dr. Nancy Rushihara. Sorry. She's at the Archaeology and Heritage Studies of the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. She's a lecturer in the Department of Archaeology and Heritage Studies of the University of Dar es Salaam, and she has been a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Exeter in the UK, and in studies in historical trauma and transformation of Stellenbosch University in South Africa. She holds a PhD in historical archaeology from the University of Pretoria, and her research interests include archaeology of resistance. Yes, I think she's already showing the presentation, but I will just finish the bio. It's very good because then she can go straight to her speech. And currently she's working on the Majimani War, a resistance against the German colonialism in Tanzania at the beginning of the 20th century. She's particularly questioning the removal and restitution of human remains from Tanzania to Germany and engaging with the use of the word landscape, museum and memorials. So I think it's good that we address this question directly, since she's been working on this. What is the experience of Tanzania with regards to human remains repatriation, Dr. Rushahora?
Thank you so much for the introduction. And the experience of Tanzania has not been different from elsewhere that we have already listened to. And repatriation of human remains have been into two phases. The first repatriation actually took place during the colonial period. It was a return of a scar that was taken by the Germans, and it was returned by the British. This repatriation caused a controversy, and it caused a controversy of the removal, the actual removal of the scar, and also the designation of the scar into a museum after it was returned to Tanzania. So this actually speaks much to what Professor CIRAJ was talking about disposed museum era, that the repatriation is actually the process, the return of the objects or human remains into Africa is actually not the end, but the beginning of a broader maybe event into African perspective, because the designation of the scar into a museum is actually unlike what the African tradition would want it to be. What you are seeing on the photo is a mass grave, which has caused the same debates about the removal and repatriation. Now, the grave has more than 100 bodies, and the community is against removing the human bodies and returning them to their families who are actually known. And the second thing is about the absence of the scars and of the bodies and human remains that are not found in African soil. So what happens then when these people you see on the photo were all executed and their remains taken away? Now, what will be the process of the actual returning of these human remains? What happens if some of these remains are not returned and others are returned? What happens? What will fill in the absence and the loss that the people will be suffering from? And you see that in the image there, the absence has been filled in Africa in different forms. So you find that the image of Songea Mbano, for example, that is circulating in Tanzania, is the image obtained from the ethnographic studies that were conducted during colonialism about race. But this has remained the only image of Songea Mbano that Tanzania is holding into. The remains of Songea Mbano were also taken to Germany. So this actually, the photo remains as the only object that Tanzania is holding into. Now this indicates how complicated the process of repatriation should be. Probably it's not the repatriation of objects and museum alone and human remains alone, but also repatriation of archives, repatriation of documents that were looted out from Africa. Another image I'm showing here is a memorial. It's a memorial that commemorates some of the victims of the colonial plunders and looting in Africa. Now, this memorial carries a name which signifies that someone was buried there or some of the remains are found there. Now, the remains of this, the first person here, Hassan bin Omar Makunganya, are not found in Tanzania soil. They are not found in Germany where it was taken, but the remains are found in America. So this also indicates how complicated the trading of human scar that went on, and how the process of repatriation of these human remains is actually complicated in terms of Africa, because our demands are always to the countries that colonized us. But now what happens when the remains are actually not in the soil of the people who colonized us, and are also no documents that support the actual removal and even the selling of the African object. Now, what has remained to fill in the lacuna has been memorialization. Now, you wonder whether the memorialization here is the memorialization of the emptiness or the absence. Is it actually a memorialization? Is it a memorial dance? Or is it actually a mourning dance? Are these people really dancing for joy, or are dancing for their own trauma? These are what the absence is creating in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rochejora. I think it was very interesting also, and we're seeing another point of view also. And of course, it becomes more complex, no, when we're talking about human remains. So now it's time for a good discussion, everyone. I have a few questions here to start with, but I think before, actually, Dr. Franzoni was speaking with Professor RASSOOL. I don't know if you want to keep on this line of discussion about these post-ethnographic museums, even this post-museum era. Otherwise, I will pose you another question. I am ready for everything. So I don't know if you want to start from there. Yes. Yes, Dr. Yes.
Yes, I think we can take that as a starting point, then to welcome other questions, for instance.
Yes.
Continuing on that conversation, I would like to maybe ask to the other participants, what do they think should be the scholarships, and how do the different scholarships should merge in such a way to create these new post-ethnographic museums. We all come from different backgrounds with different type of expertise, and we are coming together to reimagine, reinterpreting, reimagine how this heritage could be reinterpreted, what should be the procedure, the processes. And I would like to ask you, to each of you, maybe even starting from CIRAJ, how can we reshape this scholarship that deal with these collections?
Maybe Dr. Biagetti, who was raising his hand, or
yes, I mean, it's a related question actually. So I don't know if I'm answering to. I will be actually posing another question on top of Mariella's one, because according to my experience, heritage in many African societies is perceived as a living thing. So a statue is not just an object, is a sort of person. A monument is not a monument as we intend it, but it's rather it's a place to be used, that is used by the people who belongs to. So when we, in Western perception, a monument maybe has not, I mean, you cannot even touch a monument. Well, in Africa, many monuments are still lived, are still in use, are still changing every day. We have many examples of this. Some of them are also part of the World Heritage List, like the Mosque of Gene, for instance. So how can a post-museum approach can deal with this kind of heritage, which is a living heritage, where many other concepts are embedded beyond the morphology, beyond the physical aspect of the object or the monument.
I don't know if Professor RASSOOL is there. I don't know if he wants to pick up on these two questions, reflections, etc.
Yeah, if I can maybe start with Dr. Biagietti and then work my way back. You know, we are not just living with the museum. That was part of the apparatus of colonialism, and with potential museologies that are an anti-colonial, that have the potential force of the anti-colonial. But we also live inside of the categories and the administrative systems of world heritage and the instruments and the concepts and the protocols, the management systems, and the institutional edifice of UNESCO and of its policies and practices and all of the institutions that surround it in World Heritage, in ICROM, in ICOMOS. And I would like to suggest that all of this is part of the infrastructure of colonialism and the concepts of heritage that it puts forward. Now, of course, the significance, the meaning, and the conceptual existence of any monument, or what we call a monument, is always intangible. But part of what we are inheriting is a kind of colonial division between those of us in the world who are deemed to be thinkers and those of us in the world who have our feelings and our emotions. And the way certain concepts of being an African in the world and being a European in the world and assertion of who is Western and who is not, how those come to operate, and how the division happens in the management of sites and the management of collections through ICOM and ICOMOS. And you see now ICOM is under tremendous stress and pressure for how its concept of the museum does not hold any longer, except for the rear guard actions of those who think that ICOM is their organization, that they do for the whole of humanity, and that are really up in arms about how they are being challenged. But those challenges are quite significant. We don't see them to the same extent with ICOMOS and the World Heritage Convention, but I think that is going to come. I think you're right. We have to think about the relationship between the tangible and the intangible, but that for everyone in the world, quite frankly, the meanings and values of any site, as tangible as it might be from time to time, are intangible, and that it is precisely those values that we refer to as intangible, that not sort of innately African or something, but that is there for everyone. And at the same time, that that emphasis on the intangible is always pressed back into caring for the site through a conservation management plan, and you do it according to the professional standards. And if you don't, we will send in NGOs and we will come and teach you. At the same time as some of those NGOs have shown their absolute fascination for and their reverence for African earth building architectures, you know, in Mali, in Ghana, and Uganda, and are at pains when they are tampered with or even destroyed. So these are some of the deeper epistemic issues that I think we need to attend to as we think through the debates, and why it is that we must move away from the monumentalized and an aestheticized understanding of the object that gets turned into, that gets museumized and ethnographized in a certain way in the European Museum. And whereas they might be ancestral, or they might be thought of in a very different way. And that is not to put forward an ethnological understanding of how African people regard objects. It is just asking for a much more complex understanding of objects and how they are related to people, how they are related to sites. You know, in Kenya, we have this very interesting example of the vigango that were looted on the Kenyan coast, and there are so many examples of this that we can refer to. I don't know whether that begins to address some of the questions.
Yes, thanks. Thank you very much.
Anyone wants to pick up from there? Or I have another question, which is related to all this that you are discussing? No, okay. So actually, oh, okay, we have now we have a lot of questions, very good. Okay, it's better that we start with the audience. We have a question from the audience. I hope you can hear her properly, okay?
Do I take off my mask really quickly and not try to infect you all? Thank you so much for this amazing conversation so far. I'm really fascinated by this idea of taking restitution as an opportunity to rethink museums. And I was also really angered by this sort of very paternalistic way of, well, just make sure you have a proper museum before you give your stuff back. You know, like museums are fridges and you have to plug them in before you can put stuff in it. What I'm wondering is, and this is not necessarily criticism, but a side note, is that we are here sitting in a university. Everybody has a PhD, including me. And I feel in that sense, maybe again, there's something missing, right? It was rightly said at the introduction of the roundtable that museums are often these sort of foreign objects within communities. How can we make sure that also in settings like these, that we also include people from communities right away, rather than afterwards, and then say, oh, we need an educational program for the kids or something, or an audio tour, but that museums from the very beginning are, you know, wefted into the fabric.
It's a good question. Some of the panelists want to answer or leave their comments or suggestions, or
I can try if you want.
okay.
But, I mean, you know, these are important questions that are always with us. They're about the forms of authority that universities claim to have. They are about the authority that resides in the museum. And they're about the authority that should be built and should be fostered outside the museum. But the outside the museum is not just community. You need to be able to have a quite a sharp analysis of what that is, and often it's mediated through activism. And you need a kind of a sociological understanding of each site and know what goes on in each site. And it's not just the university, because universities are not, one university is not the same as the other. I mean, my university, which for a time was also Dr. Fransoni's university, is a historically Black university in South Africa that was set up to be inferior. That was set up to provide limited amounts of education to Black people to become nurses, priests, teachers, and not to aspire to scholarship, not to aspire to being excellent internationally. But that is what has happened to our university. That does so not on the back of any privilege given to it by apartheid, which is the problem of some universities in South Africa that have not really atoned for and investigated how much it was resourced by apartheid. And going through these discussions at a university in Spain, well, maybe Spain is different because Spain at one point was considered part of Africa a long time ago. And so I like that concept of Spain being Western, because it's part of the need to assert a belongingness to the West and a belongingness to Europe, because these are always politics. These are terrains of politics. But it's we have a division of labor between universities over where thought, theory, and analysis is meant to take place, and how Africans are merely meant to do caring. At my university, Museum Studies, we mainly meant to do training, not scholarship. And unfortunately, we reject all of those distinctions. And the problem, and the other thing we reject, is that the system is increasingly telling us that, yeah, we will fund you to teach South African and other African students. You are the location of African education. And I'm afraid that part of decolonization involves African scholars becoming experts about Europe. It involves European students not treating African societies as field sites. So you have to enhance, and you have to foreground, and you have to have a deliberate program of fostering African scholarship on these matters. And when it comes to community, our relationship with community should not only be in the realm of the popular, in the realm of what universities often do, which is kind of what they call outreach. We need to have a critical approach to outreach. And I think our colleagues are absolutely right. And often what we need to aspire to is the process whereby the universities are able to be taught by communities. So you reverse the expertise. We need to be able to generate forms of expertise that do not only reside in the university, and it does not only reside in the academic, and it should not only be disciplined, whether it's in the university or in the museum. And so you need, I think, quite a charged approach to a politics of knowledge.
We have a question, I think, but before that, I don't know if anyone wants to pick up from Mr. RASSOOL's comment, or if it arises some of your reflection from yours, any of the panelists. No? Otherwise, there was a raised hand in the audience here online. Mnukwana, yes, I think we can see you. Yes, hello.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Thank you for having me. I just wanted to quickly speak on CIRAJ, our colleague at UWC. I'm at the University Stellenbosch, but I work with African music. And what has come up with the Living Archive is this place of ritual and religion. As I was writing in the chat, I think of how much a place like the Veld, like a mountaintop, or the rivers and water and places of purification are places where people go and perform rites of passage. But at the same time, if we understand that culture is not stagnant, those places and the way people keep going back to them will also change. We also have it even with religion, and people have pilgrimages, especially in South Africa with the Shembe Church, and they go on a pilgrimage. And the idea of allowing people to take that pilgrimage is more important than whether are they practicing it correctly. So yes, of course, there was the comment from the audience that says, we'll only give you those artifacts if you've got museums to keep them. But with the Living Archive, it's that we must allow and be permissible to see it happening, to see the Mardi Gras happening, to see the activity of community practicing culture and heritage. And that is connected to ethnicity and not necessarily just only a history of a people. So it lives every day. And we talk of forest, we talk of medicine. We go into the forest to dig medicine, but also we see what climate change is doing to our environment. So the less we have the opportunity to go to a place of sacredness, the less our children will know about it. That is really the crux of this Living Archive, that in fact, it must be encouraged. Young boys must be encouraged to go to initiation school. Otherwise, if they don't do it, it will become a museum culture, an exhibition culture, and we will see pictures, and the people who you say this is your culture will not connect to it again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You can answer or comment directly, panelists. Thank you very much. It was very interesting, this question, comment.
I think it's a very important statement, and it's something that, for instance, has to be taken into account when we think about education. So it is good to have schools, but those schools must not replicate the English school. Throughout South Africa, they do follow the Cambridge system, but the Cambridge system does not include this type of subjects that Nukwana was talking about. So you see, it's complicated to find a way of put together a local indigenous perspective with the need of education, because it is true that if we on one side, those kids has to go to school and to learn, to be world citizens, but to be world citizens, they must be able to appreciate and to learn about their own culture. And so it is, I agree that this is another very delicate issue when dealing with African society. And obviously, instead of blindly adopting the Cambridge system, there should be a deep rethinking in a more global perspective, that includes local values, in order to, really defend an idea of cultural diversity, which is, I think, as important as biodiversity. So thank you, Mufana. Very good. I really appreciate that comment.
So, Dr. Mvimi is there? I don't know if she wants to jump in also. We haven't heard from her. She's not there. And Dr. Rushohora? Okay, actually, she suggested a question, which I think is good. It's a good starting point for keeping on the discussion, which is the following. She said, what do you think is the effect of African culture to be curated away from Africa? think it's a good question. And so please feel free, panelists, to discuss. Also, if you are listening, Dr. Rushihora or Dr. Mvimi, if you are listening at any point, please feel free to jump in. I cannot see you now. Otherwise, the rest of the panelists, if you want to answer this question or to comment.
I can just say that even if it's not my, so I'm not too much into this, but I think that from time to time the curation of African objects by non-African institutions, non-African people, just simply produce a disconnection of that heritage. So we may dramatically mistake the meaning and the sense of an object by placing it into a museum or by adopting a sort of technique that we use to preserve, for instance, object. I mean, I know that in some cultures, for instance, a statue has to deteriorate as a real living person. So you don't have just to preserve that wooden object, but you'd rather have to let it decay. So I think that just applying what we do apply to our monuments or objects can result in a very deep decontextualization of those objects. I think that CIRAJ is better equipped than me to.
Yes, no, actually very good, because the discussion is warming up. So we have two panelists who raised their hands. I think Dr. Rushihora did it first. So after Dr. Rushihora, we'll go to Professor CIRAJ.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm here. Sorry for being in and out, but I wanted to comment on the issue of museums and in African context, to say that there is actually a way that a museum can be a part of the African culture and that is in two ways. First is by including the community, but second is by imitating the traditional ways of the notion that you can call a museum that was practiced in Africa. For instance, the chief was the custodian of some of the cultural tradition of that particular society that he was ruling over. For instance, the drum, the clothes that was given to him during his coronation, all these were for him, not particularly to own, but to keep for the prosperity of that particular community. The chief was also entitled to keep the knowledge, indigenous knowledge system that were in particular communities, including in the African society, the iron working technology was actually kept under the chief and the knowledge that was involved. Among the higher, for example, the community that I come from, women were actually not trained into that particular tradition, thinking that they will get married and take away that knowledge to another community. So it is the particular form of a museum or a knowledge keeping way that Africa had. And so if the museum would imitate the same way, then it will have the African context in it. And the second version of it is including the community in the museum that we own. I have seen that happening in Tanzania, where the community have been given a voice in museum spaces, and they have changed that particular museums from the object-based form and photographs that we are used to a space, to museum as a space where a lot of activities are also taking place. So besides the curation of artifacts, there are also other events taking place. And so bringing it home as a space for the community rather than a prison for artifacts and objects. So these are the things that I can talk about that particular context. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rushohora. I think Professor RASSOOL also raised his hand. He wanted to speak. So please go ahead, Professor RASSOOL.
Thank you, colleagues. Yeah, you know, there's a lot of work happening at the moment that are dealing with these very issues of the authority of Europe, museums in Europe to display African objects and even to have them in their collection. And, you know, I'm just thinking about the visit made on at least one occasion by people from East Africa, I think from Kenya and Tanzania, referred to as Maasai, to Pitt Rivers Museum, to spend some weeks working with the collection labeled Maasai that entered that museum. And what happens when you have that kind of engagement in the museum around questions of restitution and of the power of that engagement, because on the one hand, it could be seen as merely a process of strengthening the meaning of the object in an ethnographic museum, with people called upon to lend their expertise of their indigeneity to add information to the object that the museum might not have had. But I think it's much more than that, because in the process, I just remember, you know, reading it was very, very much covered on Twitter, and there was a process of really questioning the authority of the museum to have these objects in the first place. There's also what came out of the shared collecting and shared history project between museums in Berlin, the Ethnologisches Museum in Berlin, and the colleagues from the Museums Association of Namibia who visited the museum. And this was very much at the time of the money spent on provenance research that was deployed in different museums, and you had different people on these short contracts to do this provenance research. And I remember what the first information that began to appear. Firstly, that many of those who donated objects from Namibia at the beginning of the 20th century were soldiers. They were soldiers returning from Namibia. They were returning from having been part of and having committed a genocide. And then they brought objects back to Berlin. And those objects entered the museum and were turned into ethnographic objects. So the ethnographic was turned into a kind of an alibi for the violence of the genocide. And one of the Namibian colleagues from the Museums Association of Namibia, Cynthia Schimming, I heard her make a presentation of her encounter in the store with a doll. And this was a doll that a soldier had acquired. We don't know, did he rip it from a child? Was the child killed first? Or was the doll taken first and then the child was killed? What is the relationship between killing and acquiring? And then it found its way into the Ethnologisches Museum as an ethnographic object. And Cynthia Schimming spoke about her doll that her grandmother had given her and how it felt to see the same doll in the collection. So it's what you have is a process by which objects of a history of genocide were turned into objects of the ethnographic. It is like tantamount to, if you just think, if you think in a multi-directional way about the Holocaust and colonialism and what happens to objects and what is permissible and what is not permissible in some places. So what we have to assert is we have to decommission the ethnological as a strategy of displaying artifacts and objects, artworks, material culture from the African continent. And this has to be done. We are not saying that we will take all your objects away from you. That it is not as lazy. This restitution, the politics of restitution is not as lazy and as unthinking as that. This is a project of research. It is a project of partnerships. This is not a dispossession. European museums are going to continue to be involved with the African societies from which their donors collected, from which they have cared for collections. But you're going to have a new order of museum making, a new order of exhibition making, and to tell the stories of the violence that you committed. Tell those stories of your violence in the way that you come to terms with what Germans did in the Holocaust. You come to terms with the violence of the ethnographic. And that has to be part of when you become Western and when you become European. You don't do so on the basis of some invented genealogy of philosophy or some kind of notion that is given a politics through the Schengen, the borders of the Schengen zone, through the concept of the European Union that we all experience when we get invited and have to apply for visas and go through that coloniality, where the Germans are realizing that their visa regime is not fit for purpose for this new era of partnerships, right? So it's we have to think, this is an time to rethink the relationship between African societies and Europeans. Yes, we share a colonial history. Yes, we speak European languages in our own ways. This is an African English that I speak. And it is time to make these things in new ways in the museum, so that the museum of the future is not just a new kind of ethnographic museum, but it is a museum that creates the widest democracy in our society.
Okay, so let's do that. Professor RASSOOL, I think we can keep the discussion along this about the rethinking of the relations between African societies and Europe. I think actually there's a comment on YouTube, the people who is following us along this line, which says, it is not just bureaucracy, referring to the restitution process. It is also a matter of power, privilege, and a continuation of colonialism and a strong hierarchy and arrogant behavior. So I don't know. I think it's interesting to this rethinking of this relation between African societies and Europe. I don't know if you have any idea of which proposals we could place forward, or maybe Dr. Mvimi, we haven't heard from you in a while. I don't know if you want to comment on this.
I can say that I totally agree with Prof. CIRAJ, because apart from the lack of truth that accompanies the objects that are found in the ethnographic museums, we also have accounts that were written by European travelers that were not accounts that were collected through participation with the local communities, but they were observations that were made, and we are still using them as reliable to some extent as a representation of those societies or those communities. So if museums had an active inclusion of local communities that maybe could give insights about the use of certain objects or rituals or any other activities that are going on in their own spaces, that they can say in their own words. Because sometimes we use certain words that are in English or any other language that we are using because we are scholars, we are doing research, but it will mean totally something different to them. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Rushihora, I think she wants to speak.
Yes, Dr. Vimy speaks something that resonates with some of the work that I'm also doing. And that is in terms of the documents that explain the first encounter between the Europeans and Africans and vice versa. Now, my question is that the Africans also wrote, and some of them drew pictures of their encounter with the colonialists. So those who were able to read and write, maybe after some years of colonialism, they wrote some of their information about their encounter. And artists mainly drew some photographs of different encounter with colonialism. Now, these are also locked up. These are also missing in African context, and you only find these ones in European archives. So these are also some of the material that's required to be unlocked and be available to the community. So when we are talking about objects and meaning, we are also talking about these encounters, and some of these objects are actually in forms of pictographs, maps, and drawings, which are equally significant in this repatriation and restitution agenda. Thank you.
Anyone from the panelists want to pick it up from there?
No, I may add something, you know, on the other side, something that, I mean, basically Africa's past and Africa's present is completely out also of, I mean, the textbook, the school books that I use at school. So when I say that, I mean, Africa is completely sidelined in handbooks and encyclopedias, I have to say that still nowadays Africa does not appear in the books that we use to educate our children until the Portuguese discovered Africa in the 16th century. So I think that also on the other side of the world, there's a lot to do to shape a new generation that maybe deal with this issue in a better way that we have been doing in the past.
Anyone? So in the meanwhile, we have another comment on YouTube. It says, for me, ethno anything means uncharacterized or unknown and possibly subhuman entity or knowledge. I think at some of your speeches, there was this idea also, like, I don't know if you agree with this, or if you want to comment on the ethnology and how we refer to it in the context, of course, of restitution. And we have very interesting proposals here, starting with Professor RASSOOL, no, to go in this even post not post ethnography, but post museum world even, no. But I don't know if you want to comment on this, on all these the cliches attached to this. I don't know.
Do you want to collect another question, another comment there? Nukwana, my colleague from Stellenbosch, wants to come in as well.
Okay, we can see her or listen to her? Or Nukwana?
Thank you. Now, I raised that question, the issue of this ethno anything, because I guess I have personal challenges about. I'll make the example that I actually have of notation and how what becomes a descriptor. And if we move, yes, we have decolonization, but we get to post-colonial and we interrogate actually where knowledge came from. We interrogate, not necessarily we want to only promote Black excellence or who built the pyramids or anything like that, but that if we have tools of expression, who has more right to talk about those things, especially as we talk of democratization and we talk of recentering knowledge that was marginalized in academia, as our colleague talks about this Cambridge curriculum. It's the same Cambridge curriculum that comes back and says, why are you using, for instance, Western notation to write African music? Why are you using the language that I am using now to talk about cultural and ritual things? And why are you using old text of people who were coming around the continent in the 1950s compared to the people who are coming around in the 60s, compared to all the different decades, and how knowledge has been understood, and what Dr. Mvimbi talks about this, there were people who didn't understand the language, but were writing about the culture. So can we at least make knowledge the phenomenon that it is and put it as something that we interrogate and investigate with the same vigor, whether it's written or it's oral? Because for me, as an indigenous knowledge person, it is at the point of extinction. It's not as if the music that I research, for instance, that the next generation is going to have it. But do I need permission to write it in any notation system? Because we don't require that of jazz musicians. We don't require that of people who are in Western music to do. But I've had this really conflicting thing that's happened to me where people are asking me, why am I writing African music in Western notation? So this place of ethnomusicology, even jazz in South Africa, which was actually African music or Afro jazz, and it wasn't bebop, but it was characterized as jazz, as some melting pot, as something that must be put aside until someone can actually come and write about it and speak about it. Who is that person beside the person who makes it? Hence, I make this comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Nukwana. Thank you very much. I think very interesting issue. I don't know if you would like to comment on this. Maybe Dr. Franzoni or Professor RASSOOL, Dr. Mvimbi?
Yes, I mean, for me, it's extremely interesting. The intervention is not my field specifically of expertise, but what made me think, also drawing on the comment of Stefano, of sometimes how do we treat these objects? How can these objects be treated when they are returned and reinterpreted? Some of them will let them decay, you know, instead of perpetuating this constant preservation. And on this line, my thinking goes to this paradigm that is embedded in the anthropological disciplines. That is to associate to the object, to consider the object and the archetype as a material proof of a specific truth. One of the problems of the ethnographic display is the stories that those objects are requested to told. And those stories were most of the time made up or distorted somehow, invented. So how do we tell the new generation, how do the new generation can reappropriate this object, but also let them perform in new ways, freeing this object from this duty of telling the stories that were written and rewritten many years ago. Yeah, that is my thought, and probably with the living culture of music and instrument, this is a way of bringing those traditions and those objects into life in different way, just returning them to the people to be used somehow.
I think Dr. Rushihora raised her hand.
I wanted to speak about the music and how it should be written. And for me, that question was like a big question, which is facing every angle of decolonization, whether after decolonization, what will Africa replace? What happens after decolonization? So what will fill after the decolonization process? What will fill that particular gap? So it is not a question that is being posed to music alone. It is actually posed to everything. It is also posed to objects. For instance, one of the question that Tanzania is getting because of the dinosaur that is in Berlin is the question of where will you put it after it has been repatriated? Where will you put it? So maybe that's a mammoth question that we will be dealing with for most of the things that, and it is also the agenda that is used to hold the objects that are actually elsewhere outside Africa. And with regards to
you muted yourself.
I think you muted yourself. I guess was not your intention, but you muted yourself. Okay, while we reconnect with Dr. Rushihora, I don't know if rest of the panelists, you want to comment on her statement.
No, I think these thoughts, these ideas, these struggles that you have heard about, these struggles that we have heard about are some of the decisive struggles of our time. This is the struggle of enablement of indigenous forms of expression that are not contained within the ethnos, whether it be ethnomusicology or ethnobotany, ethnolinguistics, and of understanding that knowledge has its own politics, its own structuring, forms of structuring, and quite frankly, it is not your concern if it happens in what is regarded as a European form of notation or a European form of a European script. The fact is that epistemically, the nature of the script has changed. But at the same time, we have to be alert to the traps that are set around all of these. They are traps of you've got the limits of language, so our colleague from Stellenbosch would know, the so-called language debate conceals many things at the University of Stellenbosch. And at similar universities like University of the Free State or University of Pretoria, historically Afrikaans language universities, which have had to transform themselves, but where the Afrikaans language still does not have a word for African. That's because its word for African was taken. The word Afrikaans and the word Afrikaner mean African. So its words for African people were never political. Its words were ethnological. And that is why these categories used for African people were perpetuated. Till today, those universities, they don't have African studies or African history. They have Africa studies and Africa history because of the limits of Afrikaans. But we don't have to think of Afrikaans in that way, because we know that Afrikaans is an indigenous South African language, a Creole indigenous South African language that was first written in Arabic script, and that went through a process of Europeanization as part of the formation of whiteness, as part of the process by which Boers became white people and were given the gift of whiteness in the aftermath of the South African War. These are we have to be alert to all of these questions, because we are surrounding the museum are wider questions of heritage, of cultural production, and we need to be careful. Just finally, one of those dangers that I've become so increasingly aware of, and it was mentioned by one of our colleagues earlier, how some of the most important decolonial interventionist work happening in museums is happening through artists. And unfortunately, that is happening in that way because these are also artists who need employment, and they are getting access to the limited sections of budgets for decolonization, but in a way that might not be sustainable. And the intervention of the artist might be considered to be a safer intervention because it is transitory. It is limited in time, and it is limited in duration. And we need to be able to work with artists in ensuring that we have long-term, enduring, and durable forms of intervention, so that decolonial work is not episodic and not temporary and not marginal, that it becomes the central work that we do.
What do you think, panelists? Do you agree or not? We still have 3 minutes to discuss about this, unless, Dr. Franson.
Please finish. And
No,
then
I was just saying that we have 3 minutes to discuss this, unless you want to do a final statement or some idea that you thought it was interesting to share with everyone that you thought maybe was left behind. So please go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's the intervention that the comment mentioned about the artist and the temporalities that the artistic intervention usually have. It's very relevant, something that probably those who work in the art would not think at first of a more permanent and continuous process of dealing with this collection, with these stories. In the contemporary art world, we usually conceived intervention by project, so with a beginning and a end. So I think it's very interesting. And on this note, I would like to highlight a project by Kenyan collective called the Nest Collective from Kenya. Is a queer collective from Kenya that has recently worked over 2 years on a project called Invisible Inventories. It's a project of the Goethe Institute, and which they carry out in collaboration with several museums in Africa and in Germany. And it's fundamentally a project aimed at creating a database, a digital database of artifacts of Kenyan origin scattered across collection in Europe. And they put together this database of more than 32,000 historical cultural objects. and also transforming this project into a traveling exhibition. So probably this type of intervention rather than a once-off artistic project or exhibition could be an example of a more extensive and durational change from the art world regarding this topic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Franzoni. Thank you very much. Okay, it's 1:15. If any, we need to go to the closing ceremony, but if anyone feels like he or she wants to say something that was left behind, now it's the moment. Okay, good. In the audience, no questions. Okay. Okay, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. I learned a lot from everyone, so thank you. The issue is very interesting, of course, and I think most importantly, we have also some proposals. You know, like it's not like complaining or criticizing. We have some proposals to move forward. So thank you very much, everyone. It's been very constructive. We go now to the closing ceremony. Carmela Calés, the former Vice-Rector for Internationalization of Universitat Autónoma de Madrid, the Autonomous University of Madrid. She will address everyone. And after her, it will be Isabel Valverde, who's also the former Vice-Rector for Internationalization, but at Pompeu Fabra University. So we'll start before with Carmela Calés, and then with Isabel Valverde.
Okay, thank you. Remove my mask. Thank you very much, AGUS. As you said, I'm the former Vice-Rector for Internationalization at Universitat Autónoma of Madrid. I am here on behalf of my rector, and I am in the co-chair who opened this cycle of debates as current president of the Alliance for Universities in Madrid 4 weeks, bit more of 4 weeks ago. But also I'm here because I'm one member of the team that has organized this cycle of debates. Let me tell you that these debates that we close today here have been the ultimate result of a lockdown meeting of the internationalization group of the Alliance. At the time, we were Matilde Sánchez, Vice-Rector in Universitat Carlos III of Madrid, Marius Martínez of Universitat Autónoma of Barcelona, the former Vice-Rector of our today host Universitat Pompeu Fabra of Barcelona, and myself. In that Zoom meeting, that I must confess, it was of course virtual, so every one of them were at home, but we had also a real drink, all of us. So it was a very relaxed and very fruitful meeting, actually, because then we thought about these debates. And let me tell you that Isabel, here and close to me, was the very generator of the thread idea of a cycle of debates to listen to our African partners about global problems. And it was from that first embryo that we built on as a team the whole initiative. Even after the joining of the present Vice-Rectors Irene Martin of my university and Tony Luna, who has opened his last session, Isabel and I have kept helping with the coordination until the very today that you can see us. And in a minute, she will further explain the vision we built at the time, and also the invaluable work done by our colleague scholars from the 4 universities. It is them who have gathered all the important, fabulous, inspiring participants that have made this cycle of debates and the ideas a reality. Thanks to every one of them. Thank you to all of you that are today present. It has been a very hard work from very many people, But let me acknowledge very warmly the participation of certain individuals. The first of them is Xavier Aldecoa, a journalist specialized in Africa, who not only has been a great help to reach the final format of these sessions, but also was the moderator for the first two debates in Madrid. And the person actually that introduced us to AGUS Morales that has participated in the last two here in Barcelona. Thank you so very much to both of you. And Xavier, I hope that you will listen to us. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you also to the technical support of each of our universities. It's not easy, and also in particular to Inmaculada Martín from Fundación Autónoma of Madrid for her very professional support with these blended Zoom sessions that are not, I mean, they are reality now, but they are not as easy as they look. Very warm and special thanks to a person, Gloria Rewes, the coordinator of the international group of the Alianza Cuatro Universidades, for her extremely fruitful and successful work that she has done for very many months. And I know how stressful it has been to work with vice-rectors, and even ex-vice-rectors is not easy, I can tell you. So thank you very much, Gloria. Last but not least, thank you to ICEX, that they always enthusiastically support the A4U internationalization initiatives, and among them this series of debates. For me, it has been a huge, great honor to be part of this international group of the Alianza Cuatro Universidades, and of course, to share this final time in UPF, of course, to have listened to all you, that has been really very inspiring and food for thoughts, definitely. So as I said, to share this final time here in Universitat Pompeu Fabra, Barcelona, and my dear friend Isabel Varela. So thank you very much indeed.
So
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carmela, for your words and for your friendship and generosity and help during all these years, and especially the last years, which have not been easy for any of us. And thank you to you all for being here. And just a few words to thank still some of our colleagues who have been working with us along these months and last weeks. And just then let me mention the coordinators of each of the sessions that have been having place since last October. The first person I would like to thank is Alicia Cebada from University Carlos III in Madrid, who is teaching at the School of Law, but especially is the project manager of an association which has been very helpful in the first session of this cycle, which is Mujeres por África. And she was the responsible for organizing the first session, which was, I mean, like the jumping out of these project, and which was very interesting to hear women from Africa, Spanish women, talk about their problems, their issues. And I think that is much more important, their shared problems and shared issues. Then I would like to thank José María Mella, professor of economics at the Universitat Autónoma de Madrid, and the general coordinator of another association which was helpful, or group, which was also very generous in its help. He was the person who organized the session around Africa, migrations and Africa, but seen from exactly the opposite point of view, the opposite perspective than we see it normally, that is migration seen from the African perspective. Then a week ago, or barely a week ago, Victoria Reyes Garcia, an ICREA research professor and member of the Institute for Environmental Science and Technology at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, led the third session on securing food production and in climate change environments, which was dealing with issues of food insecurity, sustainability, and of course, a global issue so much pressing today as climate change. And today, thanks very much to Marco Madella, who in difficult positions and very far away has been really working hard to have all of us together today and make of this session a real success in terms of discussion and interest, because we were dealing with a very pressing again issue, such as the restitution of artifacts, objects and remains from Africa in European or Western collections. So to all of you, 4 of you, without you, this wouldn't have been possible. And we are really very happy that you were with us from the very beginning and following all the, you know, the ways that, the difficult ways sometimes that this initiative took. And finally, just a few words about what we wanted to do. And I want just to reflect on the title and on 2 words of the title that are for me paramount and extremely important, which is the idea of reshaping and the idea of dialogue. We have been hearing today and the last days as well about Africa not being a passive recipient, about trying to get away from these negative visions, not only of the African past, but of the African present and also of the African future, of this absence of African history and on the fact that Africa was sidelined. What we wanted is to go beyond that, as Professor CIRAJ RASSOOL said today, to rethink, reshape, rethink. So think otherwise, think other way, made a critical approach of the relations between African societies and Europe with partnerships or other instrumental tools. And because the challenges we are facing are global, the issues that are at stake are global, are pressing, and they are as pressing for Africa as they are for the European and Western world at large. This is why we wanted and we acknowledge the importance to listen to other voices and to know their perspectives. And that is why we invited scholars and researchers and professionals from African universities to be here together with us. And dialogue, because it is a two-way process. It entails 2 parts that are on an equal stance and that can exchange and learn and gain and benefit from one another. So this dialogue and process, as the word was came out today a lot, that is a dynamic thing, an interrogative process that has just begun. The attendance to the debates makes it allows us to think that it's a promising initiative that should be repeated in the future, but that will be with us in the public, not as organizers, since for my friend also Carmela Calles and for me, this is our goodbye to the active place in the Alliance for Universities. So we will be very curious and waiting so much for anything you can prepare for in the future. Thank you to you all.